Okay, guys, as I mentioned, the new forms release comes out December 16th or shortly thereafter. It's the week of December 16th. And I mentioned that I would do a quick video on any of the changes. We've got some revised forms, which I've talked a little bit about. And then there's 5 new forms that are incorporated into the library. So the revised forms, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 revised forms, which I'm going to talk, really briefly about. I recommend that, as I referenced in the office meeting last week, that you go in and actually physically look at them. And the red line, and any of the changes are outlined in red. I'm not going to hit every change because some of it is really not that significant. But I'll go through them really quickly here. So the first one is an easy one. The open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. This is a form that we've already become accustomed to, and it's utilized at your open house when you're there advising the buyer that you don't represent them. You're strictly there accommodating the showing for the seller. And what they did was they added this red language in the title, and it says can be used for open house or individual private showings. So same thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be an open house, but let's say a client says, look, I'm unrepresented, but I want to see your listing. You would have them sign this same document. It can be used not only for open house, but any kind of other showing that you're doing where there's no intention for the buyer to um, be represented by you. The next document that was revised is the property showing the PSRA. So, you have the BRBC, which is the full buyer broker agreement. Then you have the limited showings PSRA, which what the change that they made here is they added a checkbox. So you have more than 3 spaces or more than 3 properties. Let's say you have 5 properties, you have 6 properties. You don't want to do the full blown BRBC. Then you have the opportunity to check the box, and then you can attach a list of properties that would be subject to broker involvement. So you have the ability to um, have more than just the 3 properties. If you're going to do more than, say, 6 or 7, then it's time for you to probably have the full BRBC. What they did do is there was no continued right to payment, so you had no protection period in the original PSRA or in the existing PSRA that we have. And the second change that they made to this document was they added that in. So you have the continuation period shall be whatever that is, 30, 45 days, 60 days. You can add that so that you have that protection period. Once the agreement expires, you have that additional time on the subject properties. The boilerplate in the back of the document explains how that works. So they've just added some language to it so that if there is broker involvement, you have that ability to get paid after the expiration of the agreement, which you didn't have that before. So in the buyer representation agreement, um, the buyer broker, the full buyer broker, um, there's clarifying language regarding the broker contingency if the buyer does not have sufficient funds. There was some confusion in the original agreement on whether or not a buyer had a contingency. If they couldn't get the seller to pay the brokerage, could they just fire their agent and move on down the road? And so this new agreement has language clarifying that. So in G2, the buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay the broker. If that box is checked, then the buyer broker's obligation is to represent the buyer in the transaction is contingent upon the seller being able to pay the amount of compensation. So it just gives you that latitude that if you have a buyer that can't afford it, doesn't have the money, you have a seller that is absolutely unwilling to pay the brokerage, then at that point, you can, you as the agent have the right to bow out so that you're not stuck in a situation where you have to represent this person for gratis. And then the boilerplate behind the table shows the language as to how that all works. I'll just add that if there is a situation where you are going to cancel the agreement, then that's something that we should most definitely talk about, because there may be some other ways to structure the deal to where we can actually make it work. And then there's also a way to shorten on exclusive agreements um, uh, the time period below 30 days. There's also a change for that. So if you want to make the cancellation period on the full-blown exclusive representation less than 30 days, then the new agreement allows you to do that as well. This is just some, you'll notice that on most of the documents that require signatures, the residential listing agreement, the buyer broker agreement, the purchase agreement, they've beefed up the language in entity buyers to make it more clear. They've just clarified the language. So hopefully it follows a little bit easier. The principals are able to understand it a little bit easier. Okay, cancellation of buyer representation. So let's say you are going to cancel the buyer's representation agreement. They've added an ability to cancel the buyer representation for certain properties only. So if it's just you're going to let them go on one particular property, you're not just canceling the full-on buyer broker agreement. If the broker is exercising the contingency because the seller will not pay the compensation, there's some reformatting in this to bring all of the compensation terms together, and the parties canceling will opt for either one of the unilateral cancellation or mutual cancellation, depending on the situation. So there could be some ability with regard to compensation to the broker, if there's expenses, or if you're going to negotiate to, let's say you're releasing the buyer broker agreement for some reason and you're releasing it to another agent, maybe you could specify that there is a referral fee coming back to you. So they've just kind of outlined that what is the compensation that would be due as a result of the cancellation of the agreement. Okay, on the residential purchase agreement, we talked about this in last week's meeting. This basically incorporates the SPBB into the actual purchase agreement, so you don't need a separate agreement for that. So it's definitely an improved situation where everything is contained here in the language of the table. And this is just boilerplate talking about how the compensation works. Let's see, again, this is the same entity buyer or entity seller. You can see that the language as it was in the buyer broker agreement has been modified so that it's just clearer for everybody. It's more complete. So on the seller counteroffer, we're going to go over some of the counteroffers. What they did in this version of the counteroffer is they added language down below. You can see it, late acceptance. So if the date of the buyer's signature in paragraph 5 is after the expiration, there was always this sort of uncertainty of whether or not it was a valid agreement or not, because they didn't exercise it within that time period. And that's what this does. It clarifies that if the date of the buyer's signature in paragraph 5 is after the expiration specified in paragraph 2A, buyer's acceptance is only binding if the seller agrees to the late acceptance by signing below. So the seller, and there's a timeline on that, 5 p.m. on the third day. So if they don't get that back, if for some reason it didn't come in timely and the agent doesn't respond, then you don't have a deal. So there is an added step to confirm that, yes, everybody's on the same page, it is a valid transaction. And in the seller multiple counter offer, again, it's clarifying that the counter is valid even if the previous offer's counters have expired. Added a new paragraph to be able to ratify the contract if the acceptance came in after the counter offer expired. So a similar scenario as to the original multiple counter offer, excuse me, the original counter offer. And this is the the balance of the multiple counter offers. So there's definitely more language. So the buyer at that point, if the seller responded after the buyer's deadline, then the buyer is acknowledging down below the same thing, that yes, it is a valid contract and we agreed to it. Buyer counter offer one, clarifying that this counter is valid even. So same scenario. So if you have a buyer counter offer, if it's not exercised within the time period that was specified by the buyer in the counter, then the buyer is acknowledging that as well. So just keep in mind that there is an additional step that's involved with that. Okay, the multiple listing service addendum. So this is document number 9. Remove the paragraph related to advertising the seller's willingness to consider offers with concessions. This was moved directly to the listing agreement. So in the multiple listing agreement, they just modified and pulled that out of the document. Number 10, modification of terms, buyer representation agreement. So modified the agreement to make it usable for tenant representation. So it can be used for tenant representation, which isn't that critical to you. Added pre-printed options to amend the property type, location of the property to be found, and to change the agreement to an exclusive agreement. So they just added some additional language to make it easier for you to make modifications to the buyer broker agreement if you choose to do that. Okay, residential listing agreement. So added a paragraph to authorize the broker to publish, advertise the seller's willingness to consider offers asking for concessions. And that was previously in the MSLA, which I just showed you. Added a corresponding paragraph to explain what seller's concessions are. And so that's what you have here. They just created some additional language within the listing agreement to clarify and help sellers understand what those concessions are. And then secondly, or lastly, on the document, you have the entity seller, same language, identifying and making it clearer what the entity seller, how that all works. Okay, summary of multiple offers. So this is a updated to conform to changes in the RPA and to provide a net price after the seller payments for buyer expenses. So this isn't a required document, but it might be something that you may want to utilize to help a seller understand what the eventual net will be. And so you can put the information for the offers. I usually just use a piece of paper, or I compare, create a spreadsheet that shows what the differences are, but this is a pretty handy, simple document that you can use to identify the deal points in each of the offers that may have been received. Obviously, we're not receiving a lot of multiple offers, but there will be times when you will have them, and it could be a valuable tool for you to use. Okay, seller contingency removal. Added a checkbox to extend escrow when removing the finding of replacement property contingency. So what this does is it just gives, if they're removing the contingency, the seller's removing their contingency to find a replacement property, then it automatically, you just check the box and it gives them the opportunity to create an extension period for the escrow for however long that they need in order to make the transaction work. Okay, got a couple new forms. So first off, we have the transfer of buyer representation agreement. So this is a new form, and it was created to help brokers in the situation where a buyer's agent leaves one brokerage company for another and continues to work on a buyer representation agreement or escrow. Failure to document the transfer to a new broker can be a DRE violation and presents a problem for E&O coverage. Paragraph 1 acknowledges and agrees. So this is just a document that would be used if you were to transfer, or you were to transfer a buyer broker agreement to another brokerage or even to another agent. Obviously, you want to talk to me about that before you were to do that, but it is something that covers all the bases for that type of transfer. Okay, cancellation of agency confirmation amendment to the purchase agreement. So this form has two uses. The first section may be used to cancel the agency relationship between the buyer and the buyer's broker before the contract has been accepted, such as when the seller will not pay and the broker has the right to step out of the transaction in the representation agreement. The second section is used to cancel the agency relationship and amend the purchase contract to reflect the proper agency relationship, such as when an agent moves to a new broker and the new and old broker and principals agree to that type of a transfer. So again, it can be used two ways. If there is a uh, cancellation of the agency because of the fact that the buyer's agent is just letting them go, or if there is a transfer to another brokerage. Okay, estimated compensation costs for buyer. This form is a tool to help a buyer understand the effects of various scenarios, changing from where the buyer's broker comes, where it comes from, where the buyer's brokerage comes from. So you can utilize this much like the seller's net. This helps a buyer sort of understand the three different scenarios that may come into play. Either the seller pays the buyer's broker in full, seller pays the buyer's broker in part, or the seller does not pay the buyer's broker any of the brokerage. So it gives you some talking points to help a buyer understand what their obligation is going to be if you have any one of those scenarios. Might be helpful in negotiating the deal in a increase in sales price, et cetera. All right, estimated compensation costs for the seller. The form is a tool for a seller to compare the net proceeds before other costs related to paying different amounts to the buyer's broker. So very similar to the buyer's sort of scenario, 1, 2, or 3, but it's helping the seller sort of understand what is going to be their obligation in order to do that. And then the last one we talked about last week in the office meeting, which was the increased deposit addendum. And they've made it with this new form really simple. You can no longer on the RPA, they've removed the area where you can designate what the added deposit is going to be. And you have to check a box. And when you check the box, it automatically pulls this addendum in. So the advantage to that is oftentimes people will write it in the purchase agreement, but they don't follow up with the addendum, which would include that amount in liquidated damages. It automatically happens under this scenario. You check the box, and then the document is pulled in to the bundle, so that you're reminded that, hey, I need to have them sign this as well, so that we make sure that it is part of the liquidated damages. And you're going to want to make sure, if you're the listing agent, when the buyer submits this thing to you, if they omit that, that's kind of a critical part of it. They can't really omit it because it's not agreed to unless they write it in an addendum or they do something different. But just remember, if there's an increased deposit, you want to make sure that this is part of your agreement, so that your seller's not caught short with that increased amount not being part of liquidated damages. The other thing I'll say is that the the bundles are all being changed. I don't have that information available as of yet. I'll advise you, but we're going to know on the 16th. What they've done is they've narrowed things down. They had a lot of redundant documents that were included in those bundles, and they're going to sort of pull those apart and not include all the huge number of documents in each of those bundles. So that's it for the forms. Those are the most important changes in the new forms. If you have any questions, I'd recommend that you pull them up, okay, and maybe review and read through what I've just given you. There are a lot more documents that have been updated, but those are primarily property management. You can reference to these documents and familiarize yourself with the language and the changes. So I've touched on the major changes. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.